been an option. But did I want to do it this year? Yes, I did, because inflation is running at above 10%, and the combination of that measure and extending the energy price guarantee at £2,500 for a further 3 months brings the headline rate of inflation down by 0.7%. And I thought that was an important thing to do in a year where inflation is the number one destabilizing influence on the economy. So although some of that effect unwinds the following year, it's in a period where inflation is predicted to be much lower, and I think it really is important to get inflation down this year. So that's why I decided to do it this year.
Okay, so next year, when the Office for Budget Responsibility predicts that inflation will be practically back down to target, perhaps that will be with a lower level of fuel price at the pump. You're saying that you're going to raise fuel duty potentially by 12 pence in an election year.
Well, the 12 pence rise was based on the level of inflation at the moment. So the amount that it would go up by next year is planned to go up in our numbers, would depend on what the inflation rate is at that point. But what I would say is that that is a decision that we will keep under review, and we'll make a decision at the next budget, and it will be decided on the basis of the room we have in our fiscal forecast, the OBR's fiscal forecasts and economic forecasts. At the moment, we do not have the headroom to do that. So that's why we are not planning to do it. But of course, we will look at what the numbers say close to the next budget and keep that decision under review.
You've got a very long wish list that you stated in this budget. You've just stated that if you can, you'd quite like to not raise fuel duty by 12 pence. You want to raise defence spending. You aspire to that to be 2.5% of growth. You want to return the aid budget when conditions are allowed to 0.7. You'd like to keep the investment allowance at 100% past the 3 years that you put in your budget. The Office for Budget Responsibility, when we took evidence from them last week, said that basically your fiscal rules allow a kind of one-way ratchet to a higher level of debt in this country, because every time there is a bit of headroom, you're going to put it into those priorities, and then when things are worse than expected, you're going to let the deficit take the strain, and that way, is one way to an increasing deficit, which is completely against the Prime Minister's priority. What are your thoughts on that ratchet effect?
I would say two things. First of all, we have those fiscal rules to make sure that chancellors are properly constrained in the decisions they take on spending, so that they have to make difficult decisions. And indeed, it's because we have fiscal rules, and I think it's a good thing to have fiscal rules, that I took very difficult decisions in the autumn to put up tax by £25 billion and to reduce spending by £30 billion. So those fiscal rules mean that whatever those pressures are, in the end, this country's Chancellor of the Exchequer is required to make trade-offs so that people can be confident that we are being responsible with national finances, and that makes the job of Chancellor. I think the Office for Budget Responsibility said that it was harder for me to do that than for any Chancellor that they had ever assessed the budget plans of, because of the fiscal situation. But I think it's good that chancellors do have to make those trade-offs, because I think it's very important that we are responsible with national finances. But to answer what's the long-term answer to your question, Chair, it is growth. If we can grow the economy, if we can get the economy growing at a faster rate than is currently planned, if we can get productivity growing faster, then we can get out of that vice. And that was why this was a budget for growth, where I tackle the two biggest things that businesses up and down the country say are preventing them from growing, which is investment incentives. So with the capital allowance, it's 100% first year deduction. We have the most attractive capital investment regime of any advanced economy, top equal to have 100% allowances. and labour supply, which is why we had the big labour supply package.
And we'll have more questions on that, I'm sure, during the session. I just wanted to raise the letter that you sent me and the committee this week about the Office for Tax Simplification. One of the things that your predecessor did that you have not reversed is abolish the Office for Tax Simplification. Is that because taxes are now so wonderfully simple, or is it because they failed in their task?
Neither. Taxes are far too complex, and there is a huge job to do to make them more simple. And I intend to be a Chancellor who makes progress in simplifying the tax system during my time in office. The abolition of the LTA was one very major simplification in the tax system.
Pensions lifetime allowance cap.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I will continue to make sure, in as far as I'm able in every fiscal event, to try and make progress on tax simplification. So I'm happy to take that as a personal responsibility rather than have a separate group of people who are funded to do that. But if you're asking, am I asking my officials in the Treasury to do work on tax simplification ahead of every budget and every autumn statement? The answer is yes. I just don't think we need to do it with a separate body.
So the Office for Tax Simplification is set up in statute. So presumably, therefore, you would welcome the opportunity to put something in statute that reflects that change that you've decided to make.
At the appropriate time, yes.
Okay, thank you. Danny.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chancellor, for coming. I just wanted to ask a general question at the outset about the overall strategy, and you described growth as the fundamental priority that will address the economic challenges that we face. You know, the government that I support has had a bumpy ride, and the economic strategies that we've had from the government in recent years, I mean, there's been a whole list. We started this Parliament with the industrial strategy. We had the Build Back Better plan for growth. We had the current PM's May's lecture when he was Chancellor. We had the growth plan from Kwasi Kwarteng, and then your Bloomberg speech with the new budget setting out your 4 priorities. Can you just, in a sense, describe the evolution of economic or in a growth strategy over recent years? Do you think there has been a consistent theme, or do you feel it's been bumpy? Because the evidence we took a few days ago from economists suggested that one of the great problems has been a lack of coherence in economic strategy, or do you think that actually we've been on a fairly coherent path?
I think it's been more coherent than you might think, with one exception. Yes, there were some mistakes in the mini budget which we had to reverse, and in particular I think it's clear you can't fund tax cuts through increased borrowing, so that is a clear thing that we changed course on. But taking that aside, if you look at the industrial strategy you talk about, I think to say that we're going to be the world's next Silicon Valley and we're going to be global leaders in clean energy, life sciences, digital, creative industries, advanced manufacturing, and to set out how you're going to do it in terms of improving the skills base, making sure that growth is spread across the country. Those are things that are what anyone would call an industrial strategy. And so I don't think it's necessary to publish a new document. I just want to get on and do it. If you look at the big decision made by Boris Johnson's administration at the start of the Parliament to increase capital spending very significantly, we have honoured that. We weren't able to continue the rate of increase that was originally planned, but we froze the increase at its higher level in cash terms. And that is, actually I should bring in Kat Little because she's in charge of government spending, but I think that is one of the biggest changes in government economic policy in recent times, that increase in capital spending.
So at the last SR we increased capital spending to nearly £600 billion over the course of the spending review period. That is the highest level of capital spending since the late 1970s. The autumn statement and the budget reaffirmed that we will have capital spending at historical highs, despite there being, as the Chancellor described, some small changes to the way in which we have set out the capital spending envelope overall. And that's a big decision to sustain that level of capital spending over the medium term. In previous encounters looking at how do you balance tax and spend overall, we might have chosen to reduce capital spending. And so I think it's quite critical for the growth agenda that spending continues at a historic high.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me come on to one of the consequences of that increased spending, which is our debt forecast. One of the priorities of the government now is to reduce the debt. I'd just be interested, Chancellor or officials, in the forecast for that, because we're looking at public sector net debt rising from nearly 90% this year to over 95%, no, nearly 95% in 28, then fractionally falling. I mean, this doesn't feel like reducing debt to me. We're trying to stabilise it is probably the best we can say, isn't it?
I think the accurate description would be we are stabilising and starting to reduce debt. You're absolutely right. It is high. It is too high. And that is one of the reasons why I didn't just spend the additional headroom created by lower energy prices, and we've ended up with debt levels that are £54 billion lower than predicted at the autumn statement. And our deficit will be £20 billion less in the final year than in the autumn statement. And as a result of that, our debt interest payments on average are going to be £6 billion a year less than planned at the autumn statement. But those are changes that are in the context of a national debt that is still going up for the earlier years. And I think the context of that is a pandemic where we spent about £400 billion supporting businesses and families. That is not consequence-free when you make a decision like that, but I think it's the right decision because what that's meant is that even despite the disruption of the pandemic, we've come out with unemployment that's still at a near 50-year low, and I think that's a big achievement, mainly because of my predecessor, the Prime Minister's decisions as Chancellor.
Okay. Thank you. So, I mean, the other cause of the high debt levels we have, in my view, is an unreformed public sector that consumes ever larger quantities of public money. And I my final question to you is to talk about public sector reform, which was one of the great missions of the Conservative government that you were served in from the beginning of our time in 2010, and feels to me that we've lost the impetus there. Other things have interceded, obviously, but still, I would like to see, or I'd like to hear from you, how you regard public sector reform as a priority for the government, particularly the chronic productivity challenge that we have in the public sector, and equally crucially, in my view, the lack of a real focus on demand reduction. How are we going to ultimately reduce the call on the public sector through economic and social policy? So just on public sector productivity and then wider reforms that might reduce demand.
I very strongly agree with you. And when I was Health Secretary for nearly 6 years, often being questioned by Mr. Barron in a different context, I was a very strong believer in public service reform in the NHS, which is our largest public service. And obviously, it's not been possible to pursue that agenda in the context of the pandemic. When we depended on the NHS, it was all hands on deck. They did a fantastic job, and we just had to concentrate on getting through that once in a century issue. But now that is behind us, and we're dealing with a waiting list of over 7 million people. We are very much thinking about public service reform, and that was why in the autumn statement I asked Patricia Hewitt to do a review of the way the NHS is structured. And particular, my long-standing concern that we have far too many targets in the NHS, which make it difficult for managers to run things efficiently on the ground because their hands are tied by thousands of targets. And we're looking forward to her recommendations.
Thank you. Anything else? Maybe Kat, you're in a position to
Yeah, I think I'd add two things to this. I think you're absolutely right about public sector productivity. It represents a third of the economy. The rest of the economy has recovered to pre-pandemic productivity levels and grown, whereas the public sector is still lagging behind. And that's because of the context that the Chancellor set out. But I think it means we have to work even harder on the productivity gain. At the same time, we've seen massive increases in input. So quite rightly, we're investing more money, more people. But the demand to see the productivity gain has got to be the focus. And I think we've done quite a lot of work to look at input efficiency. But I want to change the dialogue in government to be as focused on the productivity gain that we get from the public sector. Now, that needs digital reform. It needs us to think about the balance of preventative and responsive spend, which I think gets into your question about demand. The best way to go after demand is to think about prevention rather than response. So as we start to think about the big questions of how the state operates, public sector reform, going into the next spending review, these are the sorts of questions that we would want to be focused on.
Okay, well, just lastly, Kat, not so much a question as a plea, but last time you were before us, I raised the principle of payment by results and outcome commissioning, which I still regard as one of the great innovations in public sector reform of the last decade or so, and again seems to have lost momentum. And I wonder whether we can review that. I agree with your point about improving inputs and preventative work, but fundamentally we should be holding people to account for the outcomes that they deliver. And paying for results feels to me one of the great ways to do that. You were a little sceptical last time. Can you
So I won't repeat the conversation that we had last time I was here. I really do agree with you, and that's why we created the public value framework, which is all about focusing how we drive outcomes and then work backwards to look at, therefore, what's the best value for money to deliver that outcome. And on your point about payment by results, we are doing, as you know, a number of pilots, and it's important that we evaluate those pilots before we scale up.
For 10 years, we know it works. But anyway,
some of it hasn't worked, which is why I'm potentially sceptical.
It works as well as a lot of the public sector current spending. But okay.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
John.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, the whole team, for joining us today. Very quickly, following on from Danny's line of questioning, I completely agree with the focusing on outcomes. As Jeremy will know, we've been banging on about this for a little while, and I'm delighted to hear that that it's being focused on as a priority, certainly within the health service, anyway. But can I just continue with a few of Danny's themes before turning to inflation, if I may? I put to you, Chancellor, that there's a real risk of the UK being squeezed by the sorts of investment packages that are being declared by the US and the EU. We've got on the one hand, we've got the Inflation Reduction Act with the US, $300 billion plus, maybe more. In the EU, we've got the Green Deal Industrial Plan, a little less, but still sizable money. And this is all about, as you well know, encouraging energy security, the energy transitioning and safeguarding key technologies. Now, we've seen what you've done about the investment allowance and the writing off of IT equipment, plant and machinery deducted in full for the next 3 years. How sure are you that that's going to be enough given the initiatives we see globally? I mean, if I may add, we've seen AstraZeneca make a major decision about moving offshore. We've seen ARM, a computer chip designer. We've seen the building materials giant CRH deciding to list, etc., in the US. I mean, these are clear indications that this may be a factor in their decisions.
It's a very important question, and I said in the budget that I would return in the autumn statement with a fuller response, and there was a reason for that, which is I want the UK to remain competitive, and I needed to see, which I wasn't able to do at the budget, what the EU response was going to be before we formulated our full national response. And so we will return to this, and we're doing a lot of very detailed work. I would make 2 points. First of all, in terms of the transition to a net zero clean energy economy by 2050, it's a good thing that the United States is taking climate change seriously, and there's a lot of catch up in what they are proposing to do, because we are, even after the Inflation Reduction Act, we are spending a higher proportion of our GDP on the clean energy transition than the United States is. So we're doing it in a different way. I happen to think a more effective way through measures like carbon pricing, contracts for difference, and so on. And we've been extremely successful. We are global leaders in offshore wind. Nearly 40% of our electricity now comes from renewable sources, the second biggest renewables industry in Europe. But I'm very aware of the fact that even despite that success, which we should be very proud of as a country, this is $369 billion of subsidy, and there are risks as a result of that, and we need to mitigate against those risks. That doesn't necessarily mean matching subsidy for subsidy, but it means making sure that the overall package, which means people choose to invest in the UK, remains attractive.
I'm pleased to hear what you say, Chancellor, because this is going to be a moving target, and you sound as though you're fully aware of that. I mean, it's not just the big names. What I would suggest to you is we're leaders in very small niche technology areas, particularly in the green space, and one's hearing that those smaller companies are thinking of making the move, certainly across to the US. I mean, we should ask ourselves, why is it that so many of our rising stars on the technology front and the green front were banking with SVB, for example? I mean, it's an indication that there is a real tendency to look at the States and say, look, better tax and allowances and so forth. So all I can do is encourage you to think about, you said it's only, the investment allowances are only there for 3 years. I mean, the sooner you can put an end to that uncertainty, to allow businesses to plan, once public finances allow, then that might be a good thing. So could you please bear that in mind?
Absolutely, and I made it very clear in the budget speech that I would like the move to 100% full expensing to be a permanent change as soon as it's affordable to do so. But I wanted to set out the direction of travel. What I would say is that although there are some well-publicised stories of companies choosing not to invest in the UK, we are the world's 6th largest economy, and there is going...
5th, though.
Well, we've been overtaken by India, which I think is perhaps not unexpected given the size of the economy. What I'm saying is that we are the world's 6th largest economy, so there are going to be a multitude of decisions that go in either direction. And even this year, you can point to decisions like Pinewood investing in the UK another 9,000 jobs because we've now become Europe's largest film and TV industry. BioNTech, the people who made the Pfizer vaccine, saying they want to develop cancer drugs in South Cambridgeshire on the same principle. Airbus investing to build aircraft wings for Air India. These are all decisions that have happened this year. So I think there's a lot of positive things happening.
Okay, can I turn to inflation very quickly, Chancellor? You've quite rightly said that it's the #1 priority this year. I do suggest to you that policymakers' record generally, not just in the UK but elsewhere, has been woeful on inflation. I mean, despite clear evidence of pockets of inflation, money supply figures going up, we were told it wasn't a problem. When it became evident it was a problem, it was always going to be transitory. When that became evident, that wasn't true. It's now going to fall away. Now, I happen to be sceptical of that. I think inflation is going to be volatile and higher for a variety of reasons. But how confident are you in the OBR's forecasts of 2.9%, and that's going to be met?
I'm confident in the forecasts, but I think you're absolutely right to say there can be no complacency at all in bringing down inflation. And the reason is because a significant amount of that fall, I think 4.7% the last time I looked, is simply a mathematical result of increases in food and fuel prices working their way through the system and then falling out of the index. That doesn't mean that the prices of food and fuel have fallen down to the levels they were 18 months ago. It just means that compared to a year ago, they've fallen out. But there is still what's called, as you know, core inflation, which is driven by underlying demand in the economy, things like pay settlements, that's more than 6%, which I think is going to be harder to bring down. So I think there is absolutely no room for complacency, and we need to really keep our eyes on the target.
Well, it sounds as though you're confident about the 2.9. So, given policymakers' past record on inflation, but can I put this to you then? If everybody's confident about 2.9%, we've seen 4 bank failures, we've seen the rescue of Credit Suisse, we've seen wage growth inflation beginning to fall away a little faster than anticipated. So why then has the Bank of England put interest rates up, given that there's usually a time lag of something like 6 to 9 months before rate rises have any impact at the front end in the economy? It doesn't seem to make sense.
It's for the exact reason I said, which is that they believe that there is inflationary pressure beyond what is automatically going to fall out of the index, core inflation, and that therefore they need to continue to focus on bringing down inflation through interest rate rises. And I think the underlying reason, but I might bring in Gwyneth Nurse, who's my Director General for Financial Services, for those bank collapses, has been the move to a world where people are now anticipating higher interest rates are here to stay.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is because central banks remain resolute in their determination to bring down inflation.
Thank you for that. Given I don't have too much time, can I just remain with you on inflation? Because, if I may, and no disrespect meant, Gwyneth, it does feel as though the policymakers continue to be behind the curve, because if they were confident about 2.9, and given the time lag with interest rate rises, do you not think there's a risk that interest rate rises can go too far, given the reasonably fragile state of the global economy?
Well, I don't think we can have it both ways, and on the one hand be critical of central bankers for not raising interest rates early enough, and then on the other hand, when they do raise them, say you might be overshooting.
No, what I'm suggesting, Chancellor, is that they were too slow, that they haven't got a grasp of the situation, and perhaps it's because of the processes and techniques they use and the programs they use, but they were too slow in recognising inflation as a problem, and now they've got to the point where they are overreacting to the inflationary pressures there are, if you believe the OBR's figures of 2.9%.
Well, I don't believe they are overreacting. I think there is still inflationary pressure in the economy. I am very concerned about it, and I think we need to keep our eye on the ball. Only a week ago, we found that inflation had actually gone up from 10.1 to 10.4%, and I think that demonstrates there can be absolutely no room for complacency.
Thank you, John. Angela.
Thank you very much. When you were last here, Chancellor, it was shortly after your predecessor's catastrophic intervention in economic policy, and you were notably humble about the effects that had had. He's now been seen touting himself around for work, expecting to charge £10,000 a day. Is that payment for results that Mr. Kruger was talking about in the public sector?
I'm not going to comment on that issue because it's not relevant to my brief. What I will say is that he has said that he supports the measures I took in the budget. He thinks they were the right thing to do, and he also said that you can't pretend that the things that happened around the mini-budget didn't happen. And so I think he recognises some of the things that you and I talked about the last time we had an exchange on the mini-budget.
The rate for ex-chancellors, is that about right? £10,000 a day?
I have absolutely no idea.
I
hope never to find out, by the way, because I'm hoping to be Chancellor for a very long time.
Trying to avoid that for a few years yet, but there are those of us that will try to stymie your plans. I want to ask, if I can, about the current issue of health service pay, because as we know, there was a deal done on that the day after the budget, even though you didn't make any approaches or say anything about how these public sector pay settlements will be paid for. Why didn't you budget for the costs of this deal and be transparent about it?
Because we don't know, we didn't know, and we still don't know how much it's going to cost.
You don't know how much it's going to cost?
Because we still haven't settled all the public sector pay disputes. There's, even within the NHS, the junior doctors dispute is still ongoing. We haven't settled with teachers, and when we do settle, there will be a negotiation with departments as to how much is borne by additional support from the Treasury and how much is borne by efficiencies and reprioritisations within the departments.
The Health Secretary has said that the deal with nurses, paramedics and others, obviously not doctors yet because that hasn't been decided, he said it's going to be fully funded, and those workers are voting on it even as we speak as to whether to accept it. The Treasury have said that it's going to be got from wider spending plans for the coming year, which implies cuts to other departments. So which is it?
Well, I haven't seen the words that you ascribe to the Health Secretary, so let me tell you the government position. The government position is, as with all pay settlements, that departments fund pay settlements from the money they receive in a spending review, but in exceptional circumstances there can be a discussion with the Treasury as to any additional help. And this is a different situation because inflation was so much higher than expected, and therefore the pay settlements have ended up being higher than expected. But there is a discussion with departments as to how much help comes from the centre, and we haven't had that discussion yet.
So that means that the teachers have said that their pay offer isn't fully funded. Is that true as well then?
The commitment we've made is that there will be no reduction in frontline services as a result of these pay awards, but that doesn't mean to say that departments won't make efficiency savings and reprioritisations, and it's very important that they should, because we have a responsibility to the taxpayer in a context where we've just put up taxes by £25 billion, and we need to be responsible with public finances and fair to taxpayers.
But I'm also talking about how you can be responsible and fair to public sector workers who've had huge real terms pay cuts, even though they're the ones that got us through the pandemic in a lot of the key services. So there is some balance there, isn't there, Chancellor?
Well, that's exactly why in the autumn statement we announced, I think, the biggest ever cost of living support package, averaging this year and last £3,300 per household, targeted at the people on lowest pay, a package of support that amounts to nearly £100 billion. It's a huge amount of help, so we are doing everything we can to help people through cost of living pressures. But perhaps I should just bring in...
No,
you can stay with me if you wish, but I was going to give you a bit of expert...
with all due respect, I have a great deal of respect for your experts, and indeed worked with some of them when I was in here, but I think it's right that you're here to answer questions. So as everyone is voting on these pay offers that are going on now, your message to them is they are not fully funded, and indeed much of this will have to be reprioritised, as the Prime Minister said, from existing budgets which are already very stretched. That is your message to those people who are voting on whether they should accept these pay rises today, isn't it?
No, my message is that we will fund these pay rises in the way that we always fund pay rises, which is a discussion with departments, but we make a commitment that there will not be a degradation of frontline services for the public, and we will make sure in the way that we fund these settlements that we're able to do so in a way that honours that.
Well, I hope that that will be true, and we'll certainly see how that works out as these things go on. In your budget speech, you said, taken together, today's measures lead to a slightly lower overall tax burden for the rest of the Parliament compared to the OBR's autumn forecast. But actually, chart 4.1 of the OBR's forecast shows that tax as a proportion of GDP is higher after the budget than it was in the autumn statement. So why did you claim that it was lower?
I'll bring in Sean Jones to talk about the exact numbers, but it is true that as a result of the measures that I took in the budget, the tax burden as a proportion of GDP does fall slightly, but it is in a context of the overall tax burden increasing because of the pressures that we have on the public finances. So I was being very careful to explain that the direct decisions that I took in the budget. By the way, if you chose a 3-year period rather than a 5-year period, there's quite a significant reduction in tax burden because that's the period that we're having full expensing for capital allowances. But if you go to the full 5-year period, there is a small reduction. But maybe, Sean, you can just clarify the exact numbers on that.
That's right, Chancellor. I think the OBR said that the tax burden comes down as a consequence of your policies by 0.3 percentage points between 23-24 and 25-26, and 0.1 percentage point in the final year as a result of policies in the budget, as you say.
I think most people will experience something slightly different because of your stealth tax with frozen thresholds, which raise 119 billion over 5 years, but are going to, according to analysis, ensure that 6 million people are dragged into higher rates of tax because of the freezers. And that's the equivalent of 4 pence on income tax. Why weren't you more upfront about the effect that this stealth tax by freezing thresholds would actually have on ordinary people?
I was completely upfront, and I think I said even this morning that in the autumn statement I increased taxes by £25 billion. I never hidden from the difficult, extremely difficult decision that we took, extremely difficult for me as a Conservative because we want to bring down tax rates. But what I would say is that if you look at...
But why not
hang on, will you let me answer the question?
Put it on the basic rate. If you freeze thresholds, it happens stealthily. You accept that, surely.
Well, I happen to think this is a better way of doing it. And let me say to you, I've been completely upfront, I've never hidden the fact that we've extended the threshold freeze. But overall, one of the things that I'm most proud of is that since 2010, because of increases in the threshold for both tax and national insurance, someone on the average salary, £28,000 a year, is paying £1,000 less tax and national insurance than they were paying in 2010. That's the aggregate impact of our commitment. And what I would simply say is that the Conservative approach is that we bring down taxes when we can, but always in the context of being responsible about public finances. That's what we did with the increase in the income tax and national insurance thresholds. That's what I did with corporation tax this time, with the £9 billion annual reduction for the next 3 years. And we would like to continue to bring down taxes when we can, which is why we had a growth budget, which we think gives us the best chance of doing that.
You accept, though, that tax rates are at their highest for 70 years while you're busy saying you want to bring them down?
As a proportion of GDP, I accept that following a once-in-a-century global pandemic and a once-in-a-generation energy crisis, one of which has cost us £400 billion and the other that's cost us more than £100 billion if you include the support for businesses. Yes, I accept the tax burden has gone up for the moment, but I want to bring it down, and that's why the focus in the budget was unlocking our long-term economic growth rate through addressing labour supply and business investment.
And just one very final question which should elicit, I hope, quite a quick factual answer. How many couples are going to lose access to child benefit because of your stealth taxes on the threshold, which will take them above?
I'll have to write to you with the exact number because I don't have it to hand. But what I will say is that I think most working couples will say that the measures in the budget were going to make an enormous difference to them because of the childcare provisions, which, if you've got a child under 5, will see childcare costs falling by up to 60%, £6,500. So I think we've done everything we can to help people at a very challenging stage of their life.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you. Good morning, Chancellor. You forgot to mention the 55 billion in fiscal consolidation after the mini budget fiasco, on top of the other costs, the 400 billion and the energy crisis.
I think I did actually, because I said it was £30 billion of spending increases.
When you were listing,
and spending
I just thought
cuts.
we'd remind everybody, when you were listing the 400, just to Dame Angela, the 400 billion and the various costs, that's about £1 billion a day, over £1 billion a day in the 49 days in the former Prime Minister's time in office.
But I did mention it, just to be clear. I mentioned it earlier in the session. I talked about that consolidation very clearly.
Okay, and that was as a direct consequence of the mini-budget fiasco under the last Chancellor and Prime Minister. Before we go on to, I wanted to ask you some questions about living standards, but before that I just wanted to pick up on the Sir John Vickers's comments is also on the Edinburgh reforms. In his evidence, he said, in my view, removing ring fencing would pose a very great risk to financial stability. The governor yesterday agreed with that, as did Sam Woods of the PRA. Do you agree with that?
Okay, can I just, sorry, your earlier comment about the £55 billion consolidation being a direct result of the mini-budget, I don't accept that. That was a
Well, you had an emergency budget last November when you became Chancellor, and you apologised to the British public.
I've accepted that mistakes were made in that mini-budget and we reversed them, but I don't accept that the consolidation that we had to make in public finances was as a result of that. It was as a result of underlying factors that we had to address, which is the 400 billion.
Okay, we'll carry on arguing about that outside.
COVID
we'll
support.
Take it outside after this session because I've only got a few minutes.
It sounds like a gentleman's club if we're going to take it outside and carry on. But if that's what you wish, Miss Ali, I'm very happy to do so.
I just meant we can continue debating that outside because I've got a few questions. On ring fencing, very important. Edinburgh reforms, Chancellor. Do you have any plans to remove ring fencing now or indeed any time in the future? Because in the document there was a reference to the possibility of it being removed in the future.
Yes, so we do think that 15 years after the financial crisis, it's the right time to review the ring fencing regime, and we've had a very thorough review being done by Keith Skeoch, and we're going to announce some reforms based on the recommendations that he has made. But we have also been very clear that we will not unlearn the lessons of the financial crisis in 2008, and we will make sure that we build on the fact that, for example, for the first time, our regulators have a responsibility to promote financial stability. That is extremely important, and we will make sure that nothing we do compromises that.
You're not saying a straightforward no to removing. You're saying that. Can you just say yes or no whether you plan to at any point in the future remove ring fencing? Because the governor yesterday said that ring fencing, along with other provisions, is a complementary provision that's very important. And removing it would pose a risk to financial stability. In the document, the Edinburgh Reforms document that Sir John Vickers pointed to, the fact that the government had said that while it is worth retaining ring fencing for now, there might come a day when resolution can do the job instead. That would be the wrong approach. Are you saying that ring fencing will remain, or are you considering resolution doing the job instead?
Well, I apologise for the fact that because we haven't announced exactly what we're going to do yet, I can't tell you now in front of the committee exactly what we're going to do. But what I can tell you is that would you like me to tell you what I can tell you? We are not going to turn the clock back to 2008 and unlearn all the lessons from that.
You're not answering the question, Chancellor, with respect. I'm asking you a specific question about whether you plan to remove ring fencing despite the points that the governor has made, Sir John Vickers has made, and in fact Sir Keith had said as well that would be pose a risk to financial stability. I think that people would want to know, not least given the recent financial turmoil, that you have no plans to remove ring fencing, that it remains as a complementary provision that the regulators believe that is necessary.
As I've said, we will bring forward our plans shortly. That is not this morning, but we will bring forward our plans shortly, and then we will answer those questions. But the reassurance that I want to give everyone is that we will not do anything that compromises financial stability.
But you weren't reassured.
We will not unlearn the lessons of the financial crisis,
you're not
and we won't turn the clock back.
Sure, but you're not providing the reassurance that the governor, the regulators need, that you're not going to be removing ring fencing, which is concerning in my view. Now,
I think I'm reassuring people on
living
And
standards.
do we have a
Okay.
date for that announcement, Chancellor?
I think we've said in government parlance shortly or soon, or we've used a phrase like that, haven't we, Gwyneth, that we're very good at using in government.
We are. We're certainly, I mean, we will consult on the specific skill reforms in the summer, so there will be a paper on that, taking forward those specifics. There's a call for evidence out now on the comparison between ring fencing and resolution, and once we've analysed the responses to that call for evidence, we'll come back on that later this year.
Thank you. Turning to living standards, the OBR conceded that the British families are now facing a 2-year-long 6% squeeze on living standards, which is expected to be lower in 2026 than 2019. Can you explain why the budget prioritises giving £4 billion a giveaway to the wealthiest few? Do you think you've got your priorities right, Chancellor?
Well, that is not what the budget prioritises, and that's a mischaracterisation of budget measures. So let me just explain.
You recognise the 6%
would you let me answer
squeeze?
the question, Miss Ali?
Well, but hang on. You recognise the squeeze on living standards?
Yes, I was about to come on to that. I very
Okay.
much recognise the squeeze, and that's why there was a large number of cost of living measures in the budget. First of all, the energy support package, £3,300 per household, nearly £100 billion over this financial year and the next financial year. Then there was the fuel duty freeze. There was measures to help people on prepayment meters. There was a very long list of things to help people with cost of living pressures, and we want to do everything we can. We stand ready to do everything we can to help people with those short-term pressures. But yes, after you've been through an energy crisis, after you've been through a pandemic, there is pressure on living standards, and the long-term sustainable way to be able to relieve that pressure is economic growth. And the way to do that, one of the biggest levers that government can control, is to remove the barriers that stop people who want to from working. That's how you increase not just GDP, but GDP per head, which means that you have more money for public services, you can keep taxes lower, and so on. And the reason why what you said was a mischaracterization is because the pensions lifetime allowance is, from memory, about £700 million a year. The childcare reform that we announced is more than £5 billion a year. So if you're saying where did we prioritise, we prioritised helping working families, young families who want to get back to work.
But if you look at the background, this committee produced a report some years ago about childcare during the time that your party's been in government, and many of the childcare provisions many childcare organisations have had to close over the last decade. So you're now playing catch up, having made cuts in the past. But going on to the point about who benefits, your own forecasters say that about 15,000 people will be receiving £250,000 each in terms of tax reliefs. Okay. By contrast, what we have is nothing in the budget for over 270,000 people who are homeless. 14 million people are still living in substandard housing. 7.5 million people will still be in fuel poverty. Nearly 10 million adults already are skipping or cutting back on meals, and 6 in 10 adults are unable to afford basic essentials, Chancellor. This is after 13 years in government. And this is after what you're telling us you have done as Chancellor. And I recognise you had to clean up the mess of your predecessors. And I think there's a sigh of relief in the country that you haven't crashed the economy as well. But over a decade, and this is the situation in this country. This is what people are having to live through. What are you going to do about it? Because it's not good enough what you've done so far.
So let's just go through the points you've made there. First of all, I completely reject the suggestion that our childcare reforms are playing catch-up. When we came into office, there was no 30-hour offer for 3 and 4-year-olds. That was introduced, I believe, in 2013. I was very proud that we introduced that. We didn't have that before. That made a very big difference. I have now extended that offer to babies over 9 months and to 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds, and that is a very big change in childcare provision, which will bring us much closer to countries like Denmark, and will remove a huge barrier
for another 2.5 years.
We'll remove a huge barrier. Can I answer the question, please? And yes, because it's a huge increase in childcare provision, there needs to be a very big increase in supply. You need thousands more. If I could answer the question, please. You need thousands more childminders, thousands more nurseries, thousands more nursery places, and that takes time, and you can't do that overnight. But by September of next year, 1 million parents will be benefiting from this reform who wouldn't otherwise have benefited. Can I answer the rest of the question, please, Ms. Ali? Because you talked about something which is very
in health.
You can either let me answer the questions or not, but you asked something on childcare, and you also then asked a very important question about what we're doing to help people who are disadvantaged. And what we announced in the autumn statement and in the budget was a package of nearly £100 billion. It's simply not reasonable to say that giving on average £3,300 per household, but let's be clear, that is an average number. It is weighted to people on the lowest pay. So people, for example, on universal credit will get a one-off payment of £900, pensioners £300, people with a disability £150. Then there's the help with their energy bills on top of that. Then there's the help with prepayment meters. And if you ask me, you asked me a bigger question about what's happened after over 13 years. The answer is that the number of people in absolute poverty after housing costs has gone down by 1.7 million, including 400,000 children. So I think we have made a very big effort. One of the reasons why that's happened is because there are 1 million fewer households where no one is in work. And that is demonstrably makes a big difference in reducing poverty rates.
4 million people in poverty.
Commissioner. I know other colleagues have got questions on related topics. So, Andrea.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Chancellor.
Morning.
I have 5 questions. Really keen to get through them. The first one is, although economic participation is high relative to OECD in the UK, why is it, do you think, that post-pandemic economic inactivity has risen the most in the UK out of all G7 economies?
It's a really important question to answer, because post-Brexit, when we're not part of the single market and you have businesses with 1.1 million vacancies, then I have to answer the question as Chancellor as to how people are going to find the labour that they need, and what are the barriers. And there are actually 7 million adults of working age who are not in work, of whom some will have disabilities that mean that they cannot work, and we should support them generously as a society. But I think there are some factors. I think we have declined particularly in the over 50s who take early retirement. And that's something that the Governor talked about yesterday. And there are various reasons why people do. There are things that we have no control over. People have paid off their mortgage, they make a lifestyle choice, they decide they don't wish to work anymore. But there are other people, including a large number of doctors, who say that the way pension taxes work has prompted them to retire earlier when actually they would have been willing to carry on working. And that's why we made the decision on the lifetime allowance.
Thank you, and that all makes sense to me, but my specific question is, why is economic inactivity so much greater in the UK relative to other OECD countries post-pandemic? You know, that's all a factor for every other OECD country too. Do you think, is that something you're looking at, or is it just an unanswerable question?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, we're, I think, 15th in the OECD out of 38 countries, so we're sort of middle of the pack.
Yeah. But it's the post-pandemic. Is it, so for example,
post-pandemic, so just to answer
post-pandemic, is it because we were so generous with furlough that people have enjoyed a much more relaxed lifestyle, don't want to go back to work anymore, accept a lower standard of living as a result? Obviously, the facts are that a huge number of people, the biggest area of growth is people citing long-term illness, disability as the reason. Is that because they are being honest about their problems now, or is it that people's mental and physical health is so much worse now than it was? Do you have some of those answers, Chancellor?
Well, I think we have some of them, but not all of them, and it's something we continue to look at. Just to go back to the early retirement issue, that although we're 15th in the OECD when it comes to overall economic inactivity, when it comes to over 50s, we're 22nd. And that is an area that has fallen quite significantly post-pandemic, and that's why we thought that was an area. But I think you're absolutely right to focus on the 2.5 million people who are long-term sick and disabled. And that's a number that has grown. And I believe, that we need to completely rethink our approach. I'm very proud of the reforms that Ian Duncan-Smith introduced, which mean that there are 2 million more disabled people in work. But I think our understanding of the work that someone with a sickness or a disability can do has changed dramatically with the possibilities of working from home, Zoom, Teams, and so on. And so we need to rethink that. And that's why the white paper, the DWP white paper, announced the abolition of the work capability assessment, because we think we need to overhaul that.
Thank you. That takes me on neatly to that. So anecdotally, I have constituents coming to me who particularly women over 50, saying no one will give me a job. I'm just like, this is ridiculous. You're a perfectly competent and capable person. Why won't anyone give you a job? I also get people coming to me with disabilities saying no one will give me a job. So absolutely, I think you're on the right track to be focusing on what more can we do, not just with our own reforms and helping people into work, but also perhaps with businesses. What are we doing to incentivise businesses? I don't know whether you can say a bit about that.
Absolutely. And yes, I think that we need a change in attitudes amongst some businesses, although there are other businesses that are very enlightened in this respect. But if I give you an example, this week I hosted a reception in number 11 for a charity that puts young people between 18 and 25 with learning difficulties into work placements. It supports them for a year, and the deal is that at the end of that period they have to be interviewed in exactly the same way that anyone else would be interviewed, and only given a job if they qualify for it. And they have a 65% success rate in placing people with learning difficulties into full-time jobs. It's an amazing project, and that is because the process of supporting someone into employment actually changes attitudes amongst the employers as well, and they realise that people have an enormous amount of value to add to their organisation in a way they might not have understood before.
Thank you. Changing the subject completely, do you accept that giving families better support from pregnancy through to 2 will lead to a more economically productive but also a happier society in the long run? Would you accept that as a thesis?
Yes.
Thank you. So what will your childcare policies do for those families where one parent wants to care for their own preschool children?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of families who are under financial pressure, and they want to resolve that by both parents working, and I think that can make a very, very big difference to the life chances of children if they're able to relieve that financial pressure. Now, obviously, it's a matter of choice if someone chooses to stay at home, but I would point out that for the poorest families, who are the children who we most worry about in terms of being held back in their life chances at a very young age, we've also in the budget made very big provision for families on universal credit to help them, and we think that there are a number of families where you can make a positive intervention to a child's life chances by putting them in a stable childcare environment. And so I think this budget will have a big impact for them.
The answer, Andrea, is nothing, because unless both parents work, you won't get access to any of it.
So completely accept that for some families a nurturing childcare setting is absolutely vital, so not to detract from that at all. But there's equally millions of parents where actually they prefer, out of choice, they believe it's the right thing for their baby, their infant, to be cared for at home in a home setting. Your policies do a lot for childcare settings in nurseries, relatively little for childminders, and nothing for parents who perhaps want to work shifts so that there's always one parent at home, but that the child could be cared for perhaps by a childminder or by perhaps a grandparent. Will you be looking again at more flexibility for families, and including, will you look again at child benefit to look at how families can perhaps make those choices for themselves rather than just going with state provision?
Well, we looked at everything that we were affordably able to look at, but I would say that, for example, on childminders, we took some very specific measures to increase the supply of childminders with £600 and £1,200 bonuses for registration as a childminder, because we listened to colleagues like Siobhan Bailey who talked about the issues there. When it comes to parents who work shifts, we have the tax-free childcare system, which means that people can get tax relief on their childcare, even if it's being provided in the middle of the night or at unconventional hours. So there's a lot of support already in place, but this was a huge increase in support, which I think will make a very big difference, particularly to children in the lowest income families.
And will you continue to look at what more can be done to support families through the tax and benefit system?
We will, and we will continue to listen to you because you're one of the loudest voices in that area.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks.
Douglas.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good morning. And Chancellor, in the speech you had at Bloomberg in January this year, you said that structural issues like poor productivity, skills gaps, low business investment and an over-concentration of wealth in the South East have led to uneven and lower growth. I see a mismatch between these words and what I read in the budget statement. So how did the budget actually help solve some of these problems?
Well, a lot of things actually. First of all, it's important to say since the levelling up agenda started, 70% of jobs, salaried jobs, have been created outside London and the South East. Secondly, I think it's important to give the government credit for what we've not done given the financial constraints that we face. We've not, for example, cancelled HS2, which is going to make a big difference to the levelling up agenda by improving connectivity between north and south. There were a lot of levelling up initiatives announced in the budget, but I think the ones that will make the biggest long-term difference in spreading wealth creation throughout the country are the 12 investment zones in our highest growth industries that we'll be setting up around the country, including in Scotland.
In terms of the budget, though, if we go back to that, and what specifically was in that for some of the regions of England, for Wales, for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, that you can point to say this is actually going to be the game changer in terms of getting the country? If you're looking for high growth and you're looking for sustainable growth, what is the real drivers that you've missed out on this budget? Because it seemed to be fairly weak in terms of where you're taking things.
I don't agree. I mean, I talked very specifically at quite some length in the budget about the success of Canary Wharf in terms of regenerating the East End of London, and my desire to have 12 mini Canary Wharfs outside London and the South East, including in Scotland. And I spoke at length at the support we're giving to our high growth industries.
The money you put into that is fairly small beer in terms of what we need to do as a nation to actually get that level of growth that you want. So there's an insufficient investment being made in these areas that you're suggesting. It's a tiny hammer to crack a huge nut, and it's just not going to cut it at the end of the day.
I don't agree with the greatest respect, because you can't look at the investment zone policy, the mini Canary Wharfs, in isolation from the other things we're doing to turn this country into Europe's Silicon Valley, the huge investment in an exascale computer, for example, the overhaul of life sciences regulation. What we're doing is creating an environment where life sciences companies, digital technology companies, clean energy companies, creative industries are investing at scale in the United Kingdom. And what we're creating is 12 investment zones across the UK for them to invest in. So just to finish, because I understand why you asked the question, and I know you asked it with great sincerity, but if I could give you an example of a conversation I had yesterday with representatives from the life sciences industry who say, much as they love Cambridge and Cambridgeshire, they find it very difficult to get lab space. If we are going to continue to expand, we're Europe's largest life sciences sector, they need space outside London and the southeast to do it. So it's part of our plan to build our life sciences industry to give attractive places for people to invest throughout the UK.
You mentioned about connectivity as well in terms of driving productivity. But if you do look at HS2, and I was glad you actually mentioned it today because we were absolutely silent about it during the budget, but as HS2 hit the buffers, I mean, is it at the end of the line, as it were, in terms of taking the project forward? Because it seems to be, we've got vast cost overruns, and you know it tends just to sort of move along at a snail's pace. So you know, in terms of actually getting more bang for our buck, wouldn't it be better to actually find other projects throughout the rest of the country that would actually, you know, give us that level of productivity, that level of growth that again your government wants?
I don't believe so, Mr. Chapman, and the reason I don't believe so is a very straightforward one, which is that if you look at the reason why countries like France or Japan or Germany have been able to spread their growth much more evenly than we have in the UK, it's because they have better connectivity. If you live in Osaka, you don't think that in order to grow your business and to get big buck salaries, you have to move to Tokyo. You can get on a bullet train and you can be in Tokyo in 3 hours, and you can be back the same day if you want to. And that's why ultimately the answer, if we want growth to be evenly spread out, is better connectivity across the country. And that's why I've been very careful to protect the funding for HS2.
I'm not quite sure when the bullet train is going to arrive in Scotland or Wales or
well, as far as I'm concerned, as soon as possible.
North of England.
Liverpool
So, I think I've picked off a debate elsewhere. I think the whole point is there seems to be a level of non-connectivity between departments as well. You know, we had the levelling up debacle towards the end of last year, you know, where cities like Glasgow, formerly the second city of the empire, didn't receive any levelling up funds at all, and yet in Glasgow they've got some of the most drastic levels of poverty and so on between different areas, and you know, the ability of people to keep in good health and so on. So how is that sending the right kind of message to people all over the country if one department that I know you're not responsible for, but one department is going off on a completely tangent to how you want to see growth across the whole country? And I think we've seen it as well in the way that the tax subsidy was given during for pensions, for example. You know, you mentioned earlier £28,000 was the average wage, yet there's people that live around this area who can put £60,000 into their pension pot. You know, that's a level of inequality that is just beyond the pale.
Well, I will write to you because I think that is not a fair characterisation of the work being done by Michael Gove's department. Let me write to you with what's happening on levelling up projects in Glasgow. But it is true that in the levelling up announcement that we made recently, we did not give money to places that had already received levelling up funding because we wanted to spread the benefits of levelling up more widely. But let me also say that people on low incomes in Glasgow need their NHS to be functioning. They need doctors to be turning up to work, and they do not need doctors retiring early because of the way the pension tax system works. And so it's very, very important. We had, within hours of my budget announcement, doctors contacting the BMA saying that they wanted to come back out of retirement. And I think the benefits to people on all incomes of having an NHS where there are doctors able to do the operations that need to be done is going to be substantial.
Thank you. Douglas, that segs beautifully into Anthony. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. And I am indeed going to ask about the taxation of pensions. And I should declare at the outset that I have in the past called for the abolition of the lifetime allowance. I didn't think you'd do it, but glad that you did. But I think it's absolutely right to probe your reasoning behind it. And obviously the proximate cause was the doctors that you just mentioned. Big issue in my constituency, retiring early. But you had been in discussions with the BMA and others about a specific NHS scheme. And there's been quite a lot of criticism that you widened it out to everyone. Why? And the objective is not, the question is not, as Torsten Bell said of the Resolution Foundation, not the question. The exam question is not whether it was a good objective to encourage doctors to carry on working, but was there a better, more cost-effective way of doing it? So why did you go for the whole big gun approach then?
For two reasons. Firstly, because a doctors-only scheme would have been more regressive because it would have helped all doctors, whereas the measures I announced don't help the 20% wealthiest of doctors, and would have actually cost potentially almost as much as the scheme that we announced that applies for everyone. But secondly, because as you know, we've been discussing earlier in this session, we do have a growing problem, as the Bank of England governor said, of people in their 50s taking early retirement. And actually it is very important for the economy that we remove barriers to people working, and we change the social contract so that people feel when they come to my sort of age that if they want to carry on working, they can. Maybe it's not full-time, maybe some of it is working from home, maybe some of it is combined with volunteering or leisure activities, but we remove those barriers, and the abolition of the LTA achieves that objective as well.
One of the points that the Resolution Foundation made, and we had them in here last week, was that if you look at the groups who would benefit from this, according to the Wealth and Asset Survey, about half from the public sector and half the private sector, but about 20% were in banking and finance. And they said it was unfair that this was basically a tax cut for people working in finance, as many of them almost as doctors. Is that a concern of yours?
Well, the financial services industry in the UK employs 2.2 million people, pays 10% of our tax base. That's half the cost of the NHS. And I think we want to have a flourishing financial services sector, but we want to have other sectors that are flourishing as well, like life sciences, technology, advanced manufacturing, and so on. But it is a benefit to everyone, including people of low income, if we have an economy that removes barriers to work. And that's not just the over 50s, that's young parents who have children and might want to go back to work rather than give up work when they have a young child, which is why the childcare reforms matter. It's disabled and long-term sick people who now are able to work in a way that one could never have imagined a decade ago. And it's also job seekers who we are giving more support to work. There's 1.5 million of those. They alone could fill every vacancy in the economy. So if we can do that, what the OBR said as a result of the budget was that this was the biggest upward revision in GDP that they had ever given in a budget as a result of government policies. That upward revision in GDP makes it possible to do all sorts of things that help everyone, particularly those on the lowest incomes.
In terms of how many people it actually affects, in the OBR they said that they expected it would be 15,000 extra people would go into work as a result of scrapping the lifetime allowance. And various analysts, including I think again the Resolution Foundation, but also the IFS, pointed out that would be £80,000 per job, so it's a very expensive intervention. Do you assume you accept those OBR figures? It seems low to me, but I'm just wondering what your response is to that analysis, that it's £80,000 per job.
Well, I respect the OBR's figures. They're an independent forecast. It's their job to make a forecast. Their central forecast is that taken together, the labour supply package will bring 110,000 more people into work. But they also say that they could bring 240,000 more people into work, and that that 110,000 figure, they said on the low end scenario 50,000 or 55,000, the high end 240,000, and I believe they said and it's more likely to be on the higher side than on the lower side going forward. So they recognise that there's a range of outcomes, and I recognise it's very difficult for them to quantify what those outcomes are, but I'm hoping that we will see significant upside in those numbers.
And just add to that, they also said that more individuals responding to the pensions changes was one of the things they pulled out that might push you towards the 240,000 number. So that was an example they gave that might drive you higher.
There was some other sort of commentary or criticism that actually this could be used as an inheritance tax loophole, because obviously some forms of pensions are outside inheritance tax, and it could encourage people to transfer large amounts of money into their pension before they die, so they don't have to pay their heirs don't have to pay inheritance tax on it. Is this something that you looked at and something you might look at addressing?
Well, what I point out is that we still have an annual allowance, so there's a limit as to how much you can put into your pensions pot every year, and you still pay tax, or your heirs pay tax on the pension pot when they draw it out at their marginal rate of tax. So, so you're not escaping tax; you're just paying it in a different way.
You pay income tax,
Correct.
Which, if you're a lower rate payer, is obviously a lot less than inheritance tax.
Correct. You pay it at your marginal rate.
Yeah. I would urge the Treasury to look at the interaction between inheritance tax and pension tax, because I think there is some unusual interactions there. You mentioned you've also increased the lifetime allowance, the annual allowance by 50% to 60,000 a year, and that's obviously an increase now, but actually it was, I think, under the last Labour government, it was £250,000 a year, which is seems extraordinarily high in retrospect. I was just wondering what your rationale was for increasing that. I mean, I wasn't aware there was any pressure to increase it or demand to be able to put more in than £40,000 a year, which is quite you have to be pretty well paid to pay £40,000 a year into a pension.
Well, I might bring in Kat actually on that point, because that was partly because that was necessary if we were going to solve the issue for doctors. It was the interaction of the LTA and the AA. But
yeah, so we expected around 22,000 clinicians to exceed the annual allowance, and again, it was one of the factors that they said was getting in the way of them having sustained long-term careers in health. So for those 22,000, we hope that by raising it to that threshold, 22,000 would have exceeded it within 23-24, and that's all clinicians.
Annual allowance.
Yeah.
Wow. And that did that discourage them from working again? Was there any indication that that was the case, or they just reduced their payments?
The evidence is mixed on that, and so we need to do further evaluation once the policy is up and running.
Yeah. And have you the taper rate, because obviously you reduced the allowance at higher incomes over 200,000, I think 150,000 goes down to £10,000 a year. Have you looked at the impact of all that?
I think we have explicitly, but
that really is in the top 1% territory. I mean, that is, but it's.
Yeah.
We can write to you on that.
Thank you. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Emma.
Thank you, Chair. I have a few questions. We're super grateful if we could be as concise as possible. The FSB were really critical of the budget, and they said, and I quote, "We cannot hide our disappointment on investment and labour market. The measures that small businesses were looking for are missing. It's almost as if the government thinks that small businesses don't exist." And just in the past week, there's been a local restaurant close in my constituency, Crofters. There's been a local shop over the moon centres at risk of closing, and these are typical of a number of small businesses closing around. And obviously I know your priority is to grow the economy, but the economy can't grow if small businesses are closing. So I wondered if you could just briefly speak on, further to what was announced in the budget, are there any other plans to support small businesses or to prevent the closures and the rate of closures that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, I was surprised by that comment by the FSB, because I listened carefully to what they said they would like to see in the budget. And, for example, when it comes to investment, we introduced only a few months ago the annual investment allowance, which means that 99% of all businesses can fully expense all their capital up to £1 million, but that covers 99% of businesses. But also because they said very clearly that childcare was an issue for small businesses, as did the CBI for larger businesses.
Is there anything new coming down the path? Is there any hope we can offer those small businesses?
We are doing an ongoing consultation on what can be done to simplify the small business tax regime, and we will look at that very carefully. But the biggest point I would make for small businesses is that, having run one myself for 14 years before I came into politics, is that the most important thing is stability. And what we were able to say in the budget is that as a result of the decisions we've taken, we are not now predicted to go into recession this year, and that's very, very important for small businesses.
What retail businesses are saying to me is that cost of living crisis means people don't have the spending power they didn't, and what the hospitality businesses are saying to me is it's concerns around VAT, and it's around energy costs, and it's around the costs of keeping those businesses open. I mean, there's a number of, I don't know what the data shows, and I'm speaking anecdotally, hairdressers closing all over the place because the energy costs of running a hairdresser's have gone up so great. What I'm looking for is any good news you can give these local businesses that things are going to get a bit better.
Well, I think 3 bits of good news. The first is that we're helping families over £3,000 on average per family, and that is helping the spending power of families that are the customers of small businesses. Secondly, for businesses themselves, the energy bills discount scheme will mean up to £400 help for retailers with their bills, up to £2,300 for pubs with their bills. And thirdly, the OBR and now the Bank of England as well, saying that we're not going to go into recession. So I think you put all those things together, and for small businesses, the outlook is a lot more positive than it was just a few months ago.
I really don't think they're feeling it, but one of the places obviously you could get some money from to support small businesses is around the tax gap, and I was concerned to read that there's investment in HMRC's debt management capability, but nothing for compliance work, and obviously the latest tax gap stands around 32 billion, and the tax gap resulting from fraud has increased from 43.7% to 45%, and the tax fraud gap standing at 14.4 billion. Why has more funding not been announced for HMRC compliance work?
Well, we have been increasing the funding going to HMRC for compliance work over recent years, and we are expecting to get a lot more income as a result of that, but I will write to you with exact details of what we're doing on that.
I would just add, Chancellor, that we announced significant funding in the autumn statement to tackle compliance, and the OBR acknowledged that that would help to tackle the tax gap as well, but we can add more detail.
The tax evasion, the HMRC said, is becoming much more complex, more sophisticated, more international, and more digitally enabled. And it's revealed that UK residents hold 570 billion in tax havens. The rebel accountant, whose book is out now, says HMRC can't compete with firms that it needs to investigate because the people who they'd like to employ are actually going to work in private business. For every person prosecuted for tax fraud in the UK between 2009 and 2019, 23 times as many were pursued for benefit fraud. So why does benefit fraud continue to be prioritised over tax fraud when tax fraud brings more money into the Treasury, exactly the kind of money that we need to be giving to support our local businesses?
We don't prioritise one over the other. We want to stop them both, and we put maximum effort into both.
Why is one invested? Why is one receiving more money than the other one when tax fraud compliance money brings in more money to the Treasury? It doesn't make sense.
Well, we put in the money that we think is necessary to do the job, and it's sometimes a different amount of money required for different jobs, but they are both equal priorities. We are against all fraud, all tax evasion, and will continue to work very hard to reduce the tax gap.
As you know, the HMRC said that for every pound you invest in tax fraud, you get, was it 16 or 18 pounds back, and then when you invest in benefit fraud, you get 6 times as much back. It seems illogical at a time when the government is desperate for money, when small businesses are desperate for money, that we are not maximising making people pay the money that they owe.
We are.
Okay, so the newly announced increases in R&D benefits for SMEs, along with the added complexity of the rules, do you think that's going to affect the previously anticipated reduction in fraud and error in R&D tax relief?
I believe so, because we had a system where there was some abuse, And
Yes.
the system we've created, there's a clear gateway in terms of your R&D intensity that allows you to go through, and because of that we're able to put in checks and balances to make sure that we really are supporting companies, particularly in life sciences, but also some technology companies that are the future for the country but are loss-making at early stages. And so I think we've got a much more robust system.
So are you confident this new R&D relief won't also be abused and cost more than the 500 million forecast? Because we've had evidence on the committee at the rate of abuse, and I gave the example of a company that was saying it was doing research into making cocktails and received R&D tax relief. So do you think that you've managed to get a grip on that problem, or are you expecting fraud to continue in the way it has done previously?
Well, unless they are spending more than 40% of their turnover researching cocktails and loss-making, they wouldn't be able to get off the starting blocks. But I'm very confident the system we put in place will make it next to impossible for cocktail makers to be claiming R&D tax relief.
That would be progress. When you appeared before this committee in November last year, you told me when we were questioning each other publicly that you were willing to meet with the TUC leaders to discuss issues around funding and public sector pay. You actually stated, I am very happy to meet with the head of the TUC. The TUC wrote to you on the 7th of December, on the 20th of January, asking you for a date and received no response. They also wrote to your special advisor on the 1st of March and received no response. As a person who wants to be seen as a man of his word, why haven't you met them?
Well, I'm very happy to meet Paul Nowak. I'm looking forward to meeting him at some stage. The dates you mentioned were in the run-up to the budget, which was obviously it's a busy time for any Chancellor, and also it was in the context of public sector pay disputes, where I didn't think that that meeting would be productive, because there are discussions going on with individual union leaders and individual secretaries of state, and I think it would have added a complexity to those discussions. But he's someone that I would like to meet in due course.
When I questioned you in November, your response was, yes, I'm happy to meet them, not I'm happy to meet them but I can't meet them now because of these various reasons. And I'm sure you understand, Chancellor, why it seems concerning when a Chancellor makes a promise on a select committee, that promise isn't fulfilled.
I'm looking forward to meeting him at the appropriate time.
How quickly is going to be the appropriate time? Are we talking within this Parliament, before recess, or when is the appropriate time?
I will meet him as soon as I am able and when it's appropriate to do so. And I think you have to leave it to me to find a time that works for his diary and for my diary. But I made that commitment to you and I will honour it.
Thank you, Chair. Emma, and now someone who's been bursting to come in, Siobhan.
My outbursts are because I don't know if you appreciate, Chancellor, that most people of all political persuasions, what drives them mad about governments and politicians is big offers and small delivery, smoke and mirrors. And what I want to suggest to you, a lot of your childcare plan is precisely that. When my friends Natasha and Pete were looking at your budget statement, they were delighted. They thought they were going to be helped with childcare for 2-year-old Noah, because that couple pay more in childcare for their 2-year-old than they pay on their mortgage. Only when they looked at the detail, they aren't going to get any extra. And when the Sutton Trust, a charity, as you'll know, that looks at social mobility, looked at your package, 20% of the poorest families were not going to be able to access the 38 hours. And when we look at the numbers of 9-month to 2-year-olds, there'll be 1,369,000 more or less, and only 640 of those would be eligible for the childcare. So there will be more children not eligible. And I was just interested about your timing, because of course September 2025, when all those children will become eligible to 30 hours, is 2.5 years away, which is conveniently after the next general election. Are you just hopeful you won't have to be there to do it?
Not at all. And we are implementing these childcare plans which are the biggest increase in childcare provision, I think, in my lifetime. We're implementing these plans as quickly as we can get the market to cope with the additional capacity that will be needed.
I can understand that, Chancellor. But
hang on, you're not letting me...
No, it's my opportunity to ask the questions. Okay. I would accept that if it wasn't the case that 5,400 nurseries closed in 2020-21 and that the amount of money you're giving this year to try and meet the problem that nurseries have in funding the existing free childcare places is only 240 million, when the Women's Budget Group think that you need to spend 1.8 billion, and that well-known Trotskyist organisation, the CBI, think you need to spend 1.6 billion. So how are you boosting that interest that the industry, the nursery providers, if you are not giving them the money to actually meet the places that now exist? And back to the Women's Budget Group, who we are really grateful to, they tell us in order to bring in your plans for 2025, it's going to cost 9.4 billion, and you're allocating 4.2, so less than half of what they need to keep going.
Okay, so now we're going to do this to Ronnie's sketch thing where I answer the question you asked me before, which you didn't allow me to answer, and then I will answer that question because you asked about...
Sorry, Chancellor, but you're at a select committee and I get to ask the questions
you do,
as a member.
But you need to allow me to answer them. And you talked about 2-year-old Noah. When Noah turns 3, he will be entitled to 30 hours of free childcare. That was introduced in 2013. If someone becomes pregnant today, by the time their child finishes maternity and paternity leave, they will be entitled to 15 hours of free help. It's not the case that people will only benefit in September of 2025. The first cohort of people will benefit next April, and then there'll be another cohort who benefit next September. And just in terms of you're saying children aren't eligible, let's be absolutely clear. Unless there is someone in the household earning more than £100,000, every household is eligible if both parents are working. Correct, but that is the purpose of these reforms. It's to remove the barriers to work for people who want to work. And let me answer your last question just while I'm at it. You talked about support. Hang on.
If you're training to be a nurse or a midwife.
Can I answer your last question? You talked about the support that's going into the sector. It's £5 billion a year. That is a huge amount of additional support that's going up, but we need to build up to it gradually because there are thousands of nursery places.
Pay the bills. And if I thought that this was a sincere effort, I would have thought you'd have a workforce plan. I mean, this is an industry where something like 90,000 people left it since 2018. It's an industry where we rely on very young women to earn £5 an hour. So they are younger, they do not qualify for the minimum living wage, and that's how nurseries get by. So what is the plan to make sure that people want to stay in this industry and care for our children rather than to leave and stack shelves in a supermarket, which is what they're actually doing?
Well, we announced a number of things in the budget to improve the supply of labour to this market, including incentives for childminders and childminder agencies. And we are having a big discussion. The Department for Education is having a big discussion because this is a big delivery challenge, which I know they are determined to rise to. But the simple answer to your question is that we have said to the childcare industry that we're putting £5 billion a year on the table of additional public money into improving childcare provision. We want to work with you to make sure that we can deliver this promise because we think it's very important for the economy and it's going to help thousands of parents to get back to work.
They are saying to you they need twice that to deliver what you're asking them to deliver.
Well, some people said that, but what most people said was that this was an enormous step forward. Some of the campaigners who've been campaigning for this cried when they heard the news because they said this is something that they never imagined they were going to get. But we believe it is very, very important. So I fully accept there are delivery challenges.
With happiness, Chancellor.
I think some of them
Thank
are
you,
crying
Chair.
with tears now because they will not be able to cross-subsidise free places with fully paid for places. And to make up the difference. So the fact I'm sure you get emails, certainly I do, of mums and dads who say, I've had a letter from my nursery, they're closing next week, next month, and for some of them, the next day, because they simply cannot afford to carry on.
Well, there have been nursery closures, but this is a big step in the right direction for all nurseries, and I think anyone reasonably looks at what the government's announced and the money that we're putting behind this enormous expansion of childcare provision can see that we're absolutely serious about transforming the lives for parents up and down the country. With reforms, that will mean up to £6,500 reduction in the childcare costs that people face for a child under 5. That is a big, big step in the right direction.
You need the nurseries and you need the people who want to work in the industry.
And we're prepared to pay for it.
And there seems to be no plan for that at all.
Well, I think, the budget was a couple of weeks ago. The Department for Education now know they have got the funding and they will put in place the plans, and I'm sure you'll hear from them the detail of how we're going to deliver. But yes, we recognise it's a big challenge. That's why we're taking 2.5 years to roll out the plans in full. But that doesn't mean that we're waiting until then. In next year, September of next year, 1 million parents will be benefiting from this package. So that's a big step forward.
Thank you very much, everyone. Andrew.
Can I just further to that? Thank you, Chancellor. Just to be clear, in terms of the rollout and the workforce plan and so on, are you saying it is now for the DFE to determine exactly how this will be delivered?
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the bell will go in the final set of questions, but we will just go straight through the bell. Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Chairman. Chancellor, there are clearly two very important sectors which for the future of the UK will really matter. One is the energy sector, and you've already identified very clearly the advances we've made with regard to renewables, and the second is life sciences. The challenges with the energy sector are that, given all of those changes, the structure and the payment mechanisms fundamentally need to be changed, and the government is already looking at that. But in this mix, the challenge for businesses who do not have the same support through Ofgem to regulate pricing mechanisms to ensure that there is fairness in the system, they are therefore faced with a market where the sorts of increases that they have been asked to pay are extortionate. If I take the non-domestic, I wrote to you following your invitation with some examples of constituency businesses and public sector bodies, just to show you how bad it is. Sadly, I've not yet had a response. I set out for you very clearly that some of these businesses are looking at 400% increase. I have a local school in Devon. The increase is 800%. Now, I value what you have done for businesses. I value the new scheme. But the new scheme represents only 3% of what was on offer before. And you have the possibility for those businesses which are high energy users to apply under a separate scheme, yet to be announced, and any further information on that gratefully received. But the challenge, therefore, Chancellor, is if we are supporting our businesses, what will you do differently? Could you look at two things? One, whether or not you could sensibly extend, rather than the 3%, continue the existing scheme, which is much more generous, and look, as I've asked you before, at whether or not that list of high energy users might include pubs and the like. I appreciate they have had lots of support on business rate relief, but they are really struggling. I would welcome your comment on what support you could offer above and beyond what you've already provided.
Well, I think, first of all, I fully recognise the pressures that are faced by some businesses. And the question is what the right solution is. So as you rightly point out, we've given business what will amount to, I think, £8 billion of support this financial year and next. So a very significant amount of support for businesses with their energy bills. But the wholesale gas prices are now below the level they were when Ukraine was invaded. And so the businesses that seem to have been caught are the businesses that renewed their contracts in a period where prices were higher before they fell. And that seems to me to be not a question of subsidy, but a question of whether the market is functioning in the way that it should. And that's why Ofgem have agreed to do an investigation. They gave me an update on their investigation. They said they were, in fact, concerned about the way that market is working, and we await to hear their conclusions. But I think that is the right issue, because, as you know, that's not a regulated market, but Ofgem are looking into whether it is functioning in the way it should. And we obviously have concerns with gas prices having fallen to below pre-Ukraine invasion levels, that something isn't quite right.
Chancellor, that's helpful. The challenge is, while this is being reviewed, businesses are still having to pay extortionate bills. And it is because of that delay that I think my ask is, and I'm not expecting an answer today, but perhaps you might write to me, to look at what you might do. Even if you had phased rather than cut support, that would have helped. So let me, in the time remaining, just turn to life sciences. Life sciences, as you said in the budget, and quite rightly, is absolutely mission critical to the future for this country. And you did make some very welcome reforms, which you've already outlined, and you also looked at what you might do for MHRA, our regulator, to look at how we could provide better support. But you will know, particularly given your previous role as Health Secretary, that one of the biggest challenges is the medicine pricing arrangement, the voluntary pricing agreement. You will also be aware that that is coming up for review this year, and you'll also be aware that because of such concern, as has been referred to already at this hearing, some businesses have effectively said, this is not a country that we feel really supports life sciences. Now, that is not a message that we want. It is not, I think, what this government believes. Can I ask you, therefore, Chancellor, because you are the only person who really understands both sides of this because of your previous role, to look at this pricing agreement and negotiation and recognise that while, of course, we need to keep medicine prices low, at the same time, if we do not properly incentivise and reward the life sciences businesses, they will vote with their feet, and that is something we absolutely must not do. Will you assure me that you will get engaged in this, you will look at both sides and look at something which is fair while recognising the cost constraints that I entirely understand?
Well, I can absolutely reassure you that I'm engaging with the life science industry on this issue. I've had a series of meetings. I think I've discussed it with the leaders of our major UK life science companies on a number of occasions. And of course, we have to have something that works for them and also works for the NHS. And I think we have to recognise that a complete solution is about more than the prices that the NHS pays for drugs. It's about things like how easy it is to do clinical trials in the NHS, where we have not been doing as well recently as we were during the pandemic and pre-pandemic, and we want to look at that issue. And it's about things like speed to market for new drugs, where the reforms I announced in the budget will, I hope, make a difference. But I'm following those negotiations very closely, and I'm very hopeful that we can find a solution that works for taxpayers and for the NHS, but also reassures the life science industry that we are very committed to sustaining our position as Europe's biggest life science sector.
And would you meet with me, Chancellor, to discuss the issue? Because as you can imagine, I have been lobbied right, left and centre, and I believe that we need to find a way forward, and I'd like to see how I could help come up with a solution which actually might work.
Of course, I'd be delighted to.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. John, you've got a quick supplementary.
Yes. Just very quickly, one of your growth areas was also financial services, Chancellor, and you recognise that the City of London generates more than 10% of the UK's GDP. Now, the stock market is only a part, but it is a gateway to a lot of services, whether it be finance, insurance, legal services, derivatives, and so forth. Yet what we're seeing is a lot of companies deciding to delist. And we've seen the equity market since 2007 fall by a third, whereas others have risen, particularly the US, with their total value I'm referring to. I mean, part of the problem, very quickly, is that following the financial crisis, regulators in this country, at odds with many others around the world, encouraged our pension funds to de-risk and reduce their equity exposure. Is this something that you could look at? Because the stock market is ailing at the moment, and it is such an important gateway to the square mile as a whole. You know, we've talked about CRH, we've talked about ARM listing in the States rather than here. And could I encourage you to think outside the box when it comes to things like perhaps stopping the tax penalties when it comes to equity financing, and perhaps dusting down the Hill review, which now is 2 years old, and having a look at their recommendations?
Well, I met Lord Hill yesterday, and we had a very good discussion about his reforms, which we think are very sensible. And I think he believes they are largely being implemented. So hopefully no need to dust down that review, because I think it's happening. And I agree with your point about pension funds, and we're doing a lot of work on pension funds. That's another piece of work that I intend to have completed by the autumn statement, and I had a meeting this week with the Lord Mayor to discuss that. He's a very enthusiastic advocate of reforming our approach. I had a breakfast with the pension funds industry as well earlier this week to discuss that very issue. So absolutely committed to addressing those issues.
Would you mind meeting with me about this issue?
Of course.
Oh. That's very kind, thank you.
We have a meeting too.
Can we all have a meeting?
Are you going
Depends if you let me answer the question.
Independent meetings.
We can tell you have a very busy diary, but just a couple of quick last questions from me. It's been announced that you have reversed the Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor's, decision to issue a non-fungible token through the Royal Mint. Why did you do that?
Well, I think it's a question of demand. I think we always want to be at the cutting edge in the UK in terms of new technology, but the world has changed significantly since then, and we're not convinced that the demand is going to be there in the same way.
And then final one from me is around your experience working with a Prime Minister who has previously been Chancellor. So how hands-on was the Prime Minister in developing this budget?
Well, it was very constructive, because I have a Prime Minister who knows just how difficult it is to put together a budget package in very challenging circumstances, and he was able to help and support and guide me, and I think was a big part of the success of the overall budget package in showing the country how we are going to increase our long-term growth rate.
Slightly different answer from the one he gave me yesterday at the liaison committee, where he said he was deferring entirely to you, Chancellor. So I think that's been quite enlightening. But we've left us with lots of things to follow up on, and lots of things that this committee will continue to work on in scrutinising your budget. But thank you very much for your time and your officials' time today. Order, order.
Thank you.